The wind howled across the frozen steppe like the cry of a dying animal. Somewhere in the darkness, buried beneath 3 feet of snow and ice, a concrete bunker sat silent. Inside, 4 German soldiers huddled together, their breath forming small clouds that froze almost instantly against the frost-covered walls. 2 of them were wounded. One had taken shrapnel to his left thigh during the morning barrage. The other had a bullet lodged somewhere near his collarbone. Neither had eaten in 2 days. Their radio had gone silent 48 hours ago. And now, as the temperature dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius, they heard footsteps crunching through the snow above them. This is not a story about tactics or strategy. This is not a story about generals moving pieces across a map. This is a story about what happens when men who are supposed to kill each other suddenly find themselves sharing the same frozen tomb, when the choice becomes simple: freeze together or survive together. This is the story of a night that was never supposed to happen, a night that military records barely acknowledge, a night that would haunt every man who lived through it for the rest of his life. If you find yourself drawn into this story, consider subscribing to the channel now. What you are about to hear represents one of the most raw and human moments to emerge from the Eastern Front, a place where humanity itself seemed to freeze and shatter like ice. The Eastern Front of World War II remains the deadliest military theater in human history. Between June 1941 and May 1945, approximately 30 million people perished along a front line that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. The numbers are so staggering that they cease to have meaning: 30 million dead. That is more than the entire population of many European countries. That is roughly 6 million deaths per year, 500,000 per month, more than 16,000 per day. Every single day for nearly 4 years, the equivalent of a small town was wiped from existence on the Eastern Front. The violence was not merely intense, it was existential. Both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin issued orders that left no room for surrender. Fighting to the last man was not a suggestion, it was a requirement. Prisoners of war were treated with merciless cruelty by both sides. The Germans viewed the Soviets as subhuman, as Untermenschen, fit only for extermination or slavery. The Soviets, in turn, developed a hatred for the invaders that would eventually fuel a revenge so terrible that entire German cities would burn in its wake. In this nightmare landscape, there was no such thing as mercy. There was no such thing as surrender. There was only the cold, the killing, and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, you might survive until morning. The winter of 1942 to 1943 was particularly brutal, especially around the city of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, once the most powerful military formation in the world, found itself trapped inside a shrinking pocket, surrounded by Soviet forces that grew stronger with each passing day. Inside the pocket, roughly 250,000 German soldiers slowly starved and froze to death. Rations were cut, then cut again. Horse meat became a prized commodity. Men scavenged for anything edible, and the physical deterioration was visible in their hollow cheeks and thousand-yard stares. The wounded lay unattended in filthy hallways. Cellars were converted into makeshift operating rooms where surgeons worked by candlelight, their hands too cold to hold instruments properly. Soviet shells rained down constantly, forcing the starving defenders to seek shelter in the ruins of what had once been a thriving industrial city. But Stalingrad was not the only frozen hellscape that winter. Across the entire Eastern Front, from Leningrad in the north to the Caucasus in the south, men fought and died in conditions that defied description. The temperature regularly dropped below minus 40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, cold enough to turn motor oil into useless sludge, cold enough to crack rifle barrels and jam machine guns. Soviet troops who had grown up in Siberia found the cold challenging. German soldiers from Bavaria or the Rhineland found it absolutely lethal. In these conditions, vodka became more than a comfort. It became a strategic resource. The Soviet Army had officially recognized this reality in January 1940 during the Winter War against Finland. Defense Commissar Voroshilov proposed daily rations of 100 grams of vodka and 50 grams of lard for soldiers and officers to help them endure the harsh winter. Tank crews and other technical personnel received double the amount. The reasoning was brutally practical. Alcohol warmed the body, even if only temporarily. It prevented frostbite on the many nights spent in the open, and perhaps most importantly, it numbed the terror that every soldier felt as they waited for the next attack. Lieutenant Fyodor Ilchenko, a veteran of Stalingrad, later remarked that without alcohol, his men could not have withstood the cold. On the front lines, a bottle of vodka was often more precious than ammunition. This was not exaggeration. Ammunition could kill the enemy, but vodka could keep you alive long enough to use that ammunition. Soviet reconnaissance units, known as Razvedka, operated in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. These were not large formations, but small groups of highly trained soldiers, usually between 4 and 12 men, tasked with infiltrating enemy lines, gathering intelligence, capturing prisoners for interrogation, and sometimes carrying out targeted assassinations of enemy officers. They moved at night, traveling light, often without heavy weapons, relying on speed, stealth, and intimate knowledge of the terrain to survive. A typical reconnaissance mission might last anywhere from a few hours to several days. The scouts would slip through gaps in the enemy lines, sometimes crawling for kilometers through snow and mud, always alert for the slightest sound that might indicate an ambush. They carried grenades, submachine guns, and knives. They dressed in white camouflage during winter, their faces blackened or covered with cloth to prevent detection. They communicated with hand signals, rarely speaking above a whisper, knowing that a single careless sound could mean death. The mortality rate among reconnaissance scouts was staggering. Many units suffered casualty rates exceeding 70% over the course of the war. Those who survived became hardened veterans, men who had killed with their bare hands and watched their closest friends die in their arms. They were not cruel by nature, but war had stripped away their illusions. They knew exactly what the enemy was capable of, and they knew exactly what they themselves were capable of in return. On a frozen night in early February 1943, somewhere in the snows northwest of Stalingrad, a small group of Soviet scouts was moving toward what their intelligence officers believed was an abandoned German position. There were 6 of them in total, all experienced men who had survived at least 3 major engagements. Their leader was a sergeant named Victor, a Ukrainian farmer's son who had joined the Red Army in 1941 after German bombers destroyed his village and killed his parents. Victor was not a man given to emotion. He had learned to suppress his feelings early in the war after watching his first squad get cut down by German machine gun fire during the chaotic retreats of that terrible summer. He had survived by becoming hard, by focusing only on the mission, by treating each day as if it might be his last, because it very well might be. The scouts had been moving for nearly 4 hours, navigating by the stars and by landmarks they had memorized from aerial photographs. The snow was deep, sometimes reaching their waists, and the temperature had dropped to the point where exposed skin would freeze within minutes. Each man wore layers of wool and sheepskin, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of their footsteps. They carried their weapons close to their bodies, using body heat to prevent the mechanisms from freezing. Around 3 in the morning, they reached their objective, a low concrete structure half buried in a snowdrift. From the outside, it looked abandoned. No smoke rose from any opening. No light flickered in the narrow observation slits. The German defensive line had shifted several kilometers to the west over the past week, and intelligence suggested that this bunker had been evacuated along with the rest of the position. Victor signaled his men to halt while he studied the structure. Something felt wrong. The snow around the entrance had been disturbed recently, perhaps within the past day or two, and there, barely visible in the moonlight, were what looked like drag marks leading from the entrance toward the rear of the bunker. Someone had been here. Someone might still be here. The sergeant considered his options. They could bypass the bunker entirely and continue toward their primary objective, a German supply depot several kilometers to the southwest. But if there were enemy soldiers inside, they might spot the scouts as they passed and raise the alarm. That would compromise the entire mission. The safer option was to clear the bunker first, eliminate any threats, and then proceed. Victor made his decision. He selected 2 men to accompany him inside, while the others established a perimeter around the structure. Drawing his Tokarev pistol, he approached the entrance, a heavy steel door that hung partially open on its hinges. The interior was pitch black, but the sergeant could hear something, a faint sound that might have been breathing or might have been the wind whistling through cracks in the concrete. He slipped through the doorway, his pistol raised, his senses straining to detect any threat. Behind him, his 2 companions followed silently, their submachine guns at the ready. The bunker consisted of a single large room, perhaps 6 meters by 4 meters, with concrete walls and a low ceiling that forced the men to crouch slightly as they moved. In the corner, barely visible in the darkness, were 4 huddled shapes. For a long moment, nobody moved. The Soviet scouts had their weapons trained on the figures, ready to fire at the slightest provocation, but the figures did not reach for weapons. They did not shout warnings or try to flee. They simply sat there motionless, their eyes reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered through the doorway. Victor approached cautiously, his pistol never wavering. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he began to make out details. The 4 figures were German soldiers, that much was clear from their uniforms, but they were in terrible condition. 2 of them appeared to be wounded, their bandages dark with dried blood. The other 2 were conscious, but clearly too weak to pose a threat. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling from cold and hunger. One of the Germans raised his hand slowly, palms open, in the universal gesture of surrender. He spoke in broken Russian, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, we are finished. No more fighting." This was the moment when everything should have ended in violence. The standing orders were clear. Enemy combatants were to be neutralized or captured for interrogation. There was no provision for mercy, no allowance for compassion. The Germans had invaded the motherland, had burned Soviet villages, had starved Soviet cities, had murdered Soviet civilians by the millions. Every German soldier was an enemy. Every enemy was a target. But Victor hesitated. Perhaps it was the desperation in the German soldier's voice. Perhaps it was the sight of the wounded men, clearly dying, their lives measured now in hours rather than days. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the accumulated weight of 2 years of constant combat finally pressing down on his shoulders. Whatever the reason, he did not pull the trigger. Instead, he lowered his pistol slightly and asked a single question. "How many of you are there?" "4," the German replied. "Only 4. The others left 2 days ago. They could not take us. We are wounded. We were left behind." Outside, the wind continued to howl, the temperature continued to drop, and Victor faced a decision that no training manual had prepared him for. If you are still watching, you understand that this story is different from the usual tales of combat and heroism. Take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate the human side of history. What happened next in that frozen bunker would challenge everything these men believed about their enemies and themselves. The scout sergeant stepped back and consulted briefly with his companions. The tactical situation was clear. They could execute the Germans quickly and quietly, then continue with their mission. It would take less than a minute. The bodies would not be discovered for days, perhaps weeks, perhaps never. Nobody would ever know what had happened here. But one of Victor's men, An older soldier named Dmitri, who had been a school teacher before the war, spoke up quietly. "Look at them, Seryozha. They are already dead. The cold will finish them before morning. What is the point of wasting bullets?" There was logic to this argument, but it was not the logic that swayed Victor. Something else was happening, something he would struggle to explain for the rest of his life. Looking at these dying German soldiers, he did not see the enemy. He did not see the faceless monsters who had destroyed his village and killed his parents. He saw men, frightened, suffering, dying men who wanted nothing more than to survive until morning. Victor made another decision, one that violated every regulation and every instinct he had developed over 2 years of brutal combat. He told his men to secure the perimeter for 1 hour. They would wait out the worst of the cold in the bunker, then continue their mission. There would be no executions. Not tonight. What followed was unlike anything that had happened on the Eastern Front, or perhaps anywhere in the entire war. The 6 Soviet scouts and the 4 German soldiers found themselves sharing the same cramped space, huddled together for warmth as the temperature outside dropped to minus 40 degrees. The bunker offered some protection from the wind, but it was still bitterly cold. The concrete walls radiated a chill that seemed to seep into bones. For the first few minutes, nobody spoke. The Germans kept their hands visible, clearly expecting that the Russians might change their minds at any moment. The Soviets kept their weapons ready, equally uncertain about what might happen. The tension was almost unbearable. Then one of the Soviet scouts, a young man named Alexei, who had been a factory worker in Gorky before the war, produced something from inside his coat. It was a bottle, half full of clear liquid that caught the faint moonlight. Vodka. He had been saving it for the return journey when the cold would be at its worst and morale would be lowest. Now, without saying a word, he unscrewed the cap and took a long drink. The effect was immediate. The alcohol burned through him, spreading warmth through his frozen limbs. He gasped, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, offered the bottle to the nearest German soldier. The German looked at the bottle, then at Alexei, then at Victor. The scout sergeant said nothing, but he did not object. Slowly, hesitantly, the German reached out and took the bottle. He drank deeply, then passed it to his wounded companion. The bottle made its way around the bunker, passed from Soviet hand to German hand, and back again until it was empty. When the vodka was gone, something had changed. The fear remained, but it had been joined by something else, a fragile, tentative recognition of shared humanity. These were not monsters facing each other across the bunker. These were young men, most of them in their 20s, all of them cold and tired and far from home. They had more in common with each other than they did with the generals and politicians who had sent them to this frozen hell. The German who spoke Russian, whose name was Hans, began to talk. He was from a small town in Bavaria, he said, a place known for its apple orchards and its beer. He had been a carpenter before the war, building furniture and houses. He had never wanted to be a soldier. He had been drafted in 1941, trained for 3 months, and shipped east just in time for the Soviet winter offensive that had thrown the Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow. Since then, he had been fighting almost continuously. He had survived the summer offensive of 1942, the drive toward Stalingrad, the encirclement, and the slow collapse of the Sixth Army. He had seen friends die in ways that no human being should ever have to witness. He had done things that he would never be able to speak about, not even to his family, assuming he ever saw them again, which he doubted. Victor listened in silence. When Hans finished speaking, the scout sergeant found himself talking in return. He described his village in Ukraine, the wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, the small church where he had been baptized, the cemetery where generations of his ancestors were buried. He talked about his parents, about his younger sister who had survived the bombing and was now living with relatives somewhere behind the Ural Mountains, about the girl he had loved before the war, and would probably never see again. The other men, Soviet and German alike, began to share their own stories. One of the wounded Germans, a young man named Friedrich, who could barely speak above a whisper, described his fiancée in Cologne and the letters he had written to her every week until the encirclement cut off all mail. One of the Soviet scouts talked about his mother's cooking, about the dumplings she made for special occasions, about how he dreamed of eating them again when the war was over. Another German spoke about his dog, a German shepherd named König, who was probably still waiting for him at his parents' house in Dresden. For a few hours in that frozen bunker, the war ceased to exist. There were no enemies here, no propaganda slogans, no ideological conflicts. There were only human beings sharing warmth and stories and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, they might survive until morning. But morning was coming, and with it came the return of reality. Around 5 in the morning, the first gray light began to filter through the observation slits. Victor checked his watch and realized that the reconnaissance mission was already behind schedule. They had lost several hours in the bunker, hours that could not be recovered. If they did not move soon, they would miss the window for observing the supply depot. He stood up and began gathering his men. The fragile peace that had existed in the bunker seemed to shatter as the scouts prepared to leave. The Germans watched in silence, knowing that their fate was about to be decided. Would the Russians kill them now, leave them to freeze, or do something else entirely? Victor faced the German soldiers one last time. In his pocket, he had a small package that he had intended to eat during the return journey, a few pieces of dried bread and a chunk of hard sausage. It was not much, barely enough to sustain one man for a day, but he pulled it out and placed it on the floor between the Germans. "For your journey," he said quietly. And then, without another word, he led his men out of the bunker and into the frozen dawn. The Soviet scouts completed their mission that morning, observing the German supply depot and noting its defenses for a future attack. They returned to their own lines without incident, their report delivered to intelligence officers who had no interest in any unauthorized contact with the enemy. Victor never mentioned what had happened in the bunker. Neither did any of his men. It became a secret shared only among themselves, never to be spoken of to outsiders. What happened to the German soldiers is less certain. The 2 who were most severely wounded almost certainly did not survive. The cold and their injuries would have been too much to overcome, even with the small amount of food the Russians had left behind. But the other 2, Hans and one other man whose name was never recorded, may have survived. There are fragmentary records suggesting that a small group of German stragglers was picked up by a Soviet patrol several days later, too weak to resist, and taken to a prisoner of war camp. Whether these were the same men from the bunker is impossible to confirm. What is certain is that the experience changed Victor in ways that he would struggle to understand for the rest of his life. He continued fighting until the end of the war, participating in the liberation of Poland, the crossing of the Oder, and the final battle for Berlin. He saw things during those campaigns that made the bunker seem almost peaceful by comparison. He killed many more Germans before the war ended, and he never hesitated to follow orders when ordered to do so. But something had shifted inside him. He could no longer see the enemy as purely evil, as monsters unworthy of compassion. He knew now that they were men, just like him, caught up in forces beyond their control, fighting and dying for causes they barely understood. This knowledge did not make him a worse soldier, but it made him a more complicated one, a man who understood that the line between hero and villain, between friend and enemy, was never as clear as the propagandists claimed. The broader context of this story reveals just how rare such moments of humanity were on the Eastern Front. The ideological hatred between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union left little room for mercy or understanding. Unlike the Western Front of the First World War, where fraternization occasionally occurred during Christmas and other holidays, the Eastern Front of the Second World War was marked by almost unrelenting brutality. There were no Christmas truces, no football matches in no man's land, no exchanges of cigarettes and chocolate across the barbed wire. This was by design. Both Hitler and Stalin deliberately cultivated hatred between their soldiers and the enemy civilian population. Nazi ideology portrayed Slavic peoples as subhuman, fit only for extermination or enslavement. Soviet propaganda, in turn, emphasized the brutality of the German occupation, the mass murders of civilians, the starvation of prisoners, the systematic destruction of everything the Soviet people held dear. Both sides were correct in their accusations against the other, which only intensified the mutual hatred. The result was a war without quarter, a war in which surrender was often more dangerous than continued fighting, a war in which the only choices were victory or death. Prisoners taken on both sides frequently did not survive their capture. German prisoners were often worked to death in Soviet labor camps. Soviet prisoners were starved, shot, or simply left to die of exposure in open-air enclosures that offered no protection from the elements. Against this backdrop, any moment of humanity, any instance of mercy or compassion between enemies, becomes almost miraculous. Such moments occurred more often than the historical record suggests, if only because the men involved rarely spoke about them afterward. There was no place in either the German or Soviet military culture for stories about showing mercy to the enemy. Such behavior could be punished severely, even fatally. So the stories remained hidden, shared only in whispers among those who had experienced them. During the Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943, the fighting reached a level of intensity that had never been seen before in human history. The city, which had been home to over 400,000 civilians before the war, was reduced to rubble within weeks of the German assault. Soviet soldiers with German supply canisters after the battle became a common sight. Both German and Russian troops frequently occupied different parts of the same building, sometimes fighting room by room, floor by floor, in close combat so intense that the soldiers could hear each other breathing through the walls. In such conditions, strange things began to happen. Men who had been trying to kill each other one moment would suddenly find themselves in situations where cooperation was the only chance of survival. There are accounts of soldiers from opposing sides sharing shelter during artillery bombardments, too focused on avoiding the shells to worry about killing each other. There are stories of wounded men being cared for by enemy medics when their own side could not reach them. There are whispered tales of informal truces lasting only minutes or hours when both sides needed time to recover their dead. The remaining residents of Stalingrad, those civilians who had not been evacuated before the encirclement, often found themselves caught between the two armies, sharing their living space with troops from both sides, helping with cooking and washing, and caring for the wounded, regardless of which uniform the injured man wore. For these civilians, the distinction between German and Soviet had become less important than the simple imperative of survival. Such stories challenge the conventional narrative of the Eastern Front as a purely ideological conflict between irreconcilable enemies. They remind us that even in the worst of circumstances, even when surrounded by death and destruction on an unimaginable scale, human beings are capable of recognizing each other's humanity. They do not excuse the atrocities committed by both sides, the millions of deaths, the deliberate cruelty, the systematic murder of civilians. But they do suggest that the capacity for compassion is never entirely extinguished, even when every possible effort is made to destroy it. If this story has moved you, take a moment to share it with others who might appreciate this glimpse into the human side of the war. History is not just about battles and strategies. It is about the people who lived through those battles, who made impossible choices, who sometimes found humanity in the most inhuman circumstances. The role of vodka in the Soviet military during the Second World War cannot be overstated. What began as an emergency measure during the Winter War against Finland became a permanent institution, an official ration that was distributed to frontline soldiers throughout the conflict. The 100-gram ration, known colloquially as the Narkom's 100 grams after People's Commissar Anastas Mikoyan, who oversaw its distribution, became as essential to the Soviet soldier as his rifle or his boots. The alcohol served multiple purposes. Most obviously, it provided temporary warmth in conditions where warmth could mean the difference between life and death. A man who drank his vodka ration before a night in the trenches had a better chance of surviving until morning than a man who did not. The physiological effects were actually more complex than this simple warming sensation might suggest. Alcohol dilates blood vessels near the skin, creating a feeling of warmth while actually accelerating heat loss from the body's core. But in moderation, and especially when combined with food and proper shelter, the psychological benefits outweighed the physiological risks. Beyond its warming properties, vodka served as a critical morale booster. Soldiers who had watched their friends die, who had committed acts of violence that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, who faced each day with the near certainty that it might be their last, found that alcohol dulled the edge of their terror. It did not eliminate fear, but it made fear manageable. It allowed men to function in conditions that would otherwise have driven them mad. Vodka also became a form of currency on the front lines. Soldiers traded their rations for food, for equipment, for information. In some cases, they traded vodka with civilians in exchange for shelter or supplies. There are even documented cases of Soviet soldiers trading with German soldiers during brief informal truces, exchanging vodka for German cigarettes or chocolate. Such trades were strictly forbidden by both armies, but they happened nonetheless, driven by the universal human desire for comfort and connection. The German army had its own alcohol rations, though they were generally smaller than the Soviet equivalent. German soldiers received beer and wine rather than hard spirits, reflecting the different drinking cultures of the two nations. But as the war progressed and supplies became increasingly unreliable, German soldiers became increasingly desperate for any source of alcohol. During their retreat from the Soviet Union, German forces sometimes left behind large quantities of industrial alcohol containing methanol, labeled as drinkable beverages, in an attempt to poison pursuing Soviet troops. This insidious tactic killed thousands of Soviet soldiers who unknowingly consumed the contaminated liquid. The darker side of alcohol consumption on the Eastern Front was also significant. While moderate drinking provided genuine benefits, excessive consumption led to serious problems. Soviet soldiers suffering from alcohol abuse sometimes passed out in the open and froze to death, contributing to the high rate of non-combat casualties that plagued the Red Army throughout the war. Drunkenness impaired judgment, leading to tactical errors that cost lives, and the physical addiction that developed among heavy drinkers created long-term health problems that persisted long after the war ended. Yet despite these risks, alcohol remained an integral part of the Soviet soldiers' experience. It was present at celebrations and at funerals, at victories and at defeats. It marked the transition from civilian to soldier and from soldier to veteran. And in moments of unexpected human connection, like that night in the frozen bunker, it served as a bridge between men who should have been enemies. The experience of Soviet reconnaissance scouts during the war has only recently begun to receive serious historical attention. For decades, the stories of these men were classified, hidden in military archives that were inaccessible to researchers. What we know comes primarily from memoirs written after the fall of the Soviet Union, when veterans were finally free to share their experiences without fear of official censorship. These memoirs reveal a world of extraordinary danger and remarkable courage. The scouts operated in conditions that would have been impossible for larger formations. They moved through enemy territory for days at a time, cut off from all support, relying on their own skills and on each other to survive. They carried out missions that conventional forces could not, gathering intelligence that proved decisive in major battles, capturing prisoners who revealed critical information about German plans and capabilities. The psychological toll of this work was immense. Unlike regular infantry soldiers who fought in the relative safety of numbers, the scouts faced the enemy in small groups, often alone. Every mission was a dance with death, every encounter a potential ambush. The men who survived developed a particular kind of awareness, a constant alertness to danger that never entirely faded even after the war ended. Many of them suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though this condition was not recognized or treated in the Soviet Union. But the scouts also developed close bonds with each other, forged in the fires of shared danger. They trusted each other with their lives, and that trust created a kind of intimacy that is rare in ordinary human experience. When one of their number fell in battle, the loss was felt with devastating intensity. And when, on rare occasions, they encountered situations that challenged their understanding of the enemy, they had to navigate these challenges together, relying on their shared judgment to make decisions that no regulation had anticipated. The story of Victor and his men in the frozen bunker is just one example of many such unrecorded moments. Across the Eastern Front, in countless encounters that were never written down, Soviet scouts and German soldiers faced each other in circumstances that defied the simple categories of friend and foe. Sometimes these encounters ended in violence, sometimes they ended in unexpected humanity, and sometimes they ended in something in between, a kind of mutual recognition that was neither friendship nor enmity, but simply acknowledgement of shared suffering. The aftermath of the Stalingrad battle marked a turning point in the war, not only militarily, but also psychologically. The German defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. For the first time, an entire German army had been destroyed in the field, its commander surrendering to Soviet forces despite Hitler's explicit orders to fight to the last man. The psychological impact on both armies was profound. For the Germans, Stalingrad represented the beginning of the end. Though the war would continue for more than 2 years, the strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the German army would be on the defensive, fighting not to win but simply to delay the inevitable. Morale, which had been high during the advances of 1941 and 42, began to collapse. Soldiers who had once believed in final victory now fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was a vindication and a warning. It proved that the German war machine could be defeated, that the invaders who had seemed unstoppable in the summer of 1941 were in fact vulnerable. But it also revealed the cost of that vulnerability. The Soviets had lost more than 1 million men killed, wounded, or captured in the Stalingrad campaign alone. The victory had been purchased with blood on a scale that defied comprehension. The frozen bunker where Victor and his men encountered the wounded Germans was just one of thousands of such positions scattered across the Stalingrad battlefield. Some had been carefully constructed by German engineers with reinforced concrete walls and elaborate defensive works. Others were improvised shelters, hastily dug into the frozen earth, or constructed from the rubble of destroyed buildings. All of them bore witness to the terrible suffering that had occurred within and around them. After the battle, Soviet soldiers moving through the former German positions discovered scenes of unimaginable horror. Men frozen to death in their positions, their bodies preserved by the cold in attitudes of final desperation. Improvised hospitals where the wounded had lain untreated for weeks, dying slowly of infection and starvation. Mass graves hastily dug and hastily filled, containing the remains of thousands of soldiers who would never be identified. The landscape itself seemed to cry out in pain, the snow stained red, the air thick with the smell of death that the cold could not entirely suppress. For the survivors, both German and Soviet, the memories of that winter would never fade. Decades later, veterans of Stalingrad would still wake in the night, haunted by dreams of the cold, the hunger, the constant fear. They would still flinch at unexpected loud noises, still find themselves scanning for cover whenever they entered an unfamiliar space. The war had marked them, and the marks would never entirely heal. The final chapter of this story belongs to the men who lived it. Viktor survived the war, though many of his fellow scouts did not. He returned to Ukraine after the German surrender, to a village that no longer existed, to a family that had been scattered by the winds of war. His parents were dead. His sister had married a factory worker in Sverdlovsk and moved to Siberia. The girl he had loved was gone, vanished into the chaos of evacuation, and never seen again. He rebuilt his life as best he could, working as a collective farm manager, raising a family, never speaking about the war except in the most general terms. But sometimes, late at night, when he could not sleep and the vodka was flowing freely, he would think about that bunker and the men he had met there. He would wonder what had happened to Hans, the German carpenter from Bavaria who had spoken Russian and shared his bread. He would wonder if the wounded men had survived, if any of them had made it home to the families who were waiting for them. He never found out. The Iron Curtain that descended over Europe after the war made it impossible to search for answers. And even if the curtain had not existed, what would he have said? What possible words could bridge the gap between that frozen night and the normal world of peacetime? The experience in the bunker had taught Viktor something that he would carry for the rest of his life. It had taught him that enemies are not always what they seem, that the propaganda which makes war possible is built on lies and simplifications. The Germans he had met that night were not monsters. They were men, no different from himself, caught up in a catastrophe that none of them had chosen, and none of them could escape. This knowledge did not make Viktor a pacifist. He believed that the war against Nazi Germany had been necessary, that the Soviet Union had been right to fight, that the millions who had not died in vain. But he also understood that the cost of that war, in human terms, could never be fully calculated. Every German soldier who froze to death in the Stalingrad pocket had been someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. Every Soviet soldier who fell in the liberation of Europe had left behind a family who would mourn him forever. The arithmetic of total war, in which victory was measured in enemy dead, could never capture the full truth of what had happened. In his later years, Viktor began to write about his experiences, filling notebooks with accounts of the war that he had never shared before. Most of these notebooks were lost after his death, destroyed by family members who did not understand their value or were too pained by their contents to preserve them. But fragments survived, including a brief account of the night in the bunker that has only recently come to light. In his own words, "We were supposed to kill them. That was our mission. That was what we had been trained to do. But looking at those men, freezing and dying in the darkness, I could not see enemies. I could only see human beings. And in that moment I understood something that I have never forgotten. The war was necessary. The killing was necessary. But every time we killed, a small part of our own humanity died as well. We won the war, but we all lost something that can never be recovered." These words, written decades after the events they describe, capture the essential tragedy of the Eastern Front. It was a war that had to be fought, a war against an evil that threatened to consume the world. But it was also a war that consumed the men who fought it, stripping away their illusions, forcing them to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, leaving them scarred in ways that would never fully heal. The story of the frozen bunker is ultimately a story about the limits of hatred. Even in the worst of circumstances, even when surrounded by death and destruction, the human capacity for connection cannot be entirely suppressed. Victor and his men found something in that bunker that the propaganda machines of both sides had tried to destroy. They found the simple truth that their enemies were human beings, just like them. This truth does not excuse the atrocities of the Second World War. It does not diminish the crimes of the Nazi regime or the suffering of its victims. It does not suggest that the war should not have been fought, or that the Allied victory was anything other than a moral necessity. But it does remind us that war is never simple, that the divisions between good and evil are never as clear as they seem, that even the most justified conflict carries a cost that cannot be fully measured. The Eastern Front of the Second World War remains the bloodiest theater of combat in human history. Tens of millions died in 4 years of unrelenting violence. Cities were destroyed, populations were displaced, entire regions were transformed into wastelands. The scars of that conflict are still visible today in the landscapes of Eastern Europe, in the memories of the survivors and their descendants, in the collective trauma of nations that have never fully recovered. But amid all this death and destruction, there were moments of grace. There were times when men who were supposed to be enemies recognized each other's humanity. There were nights when vodka was shared across the lines of battle, when stories were exchanged, when the simple human need for connection overcame the ideological forces that demanded hatred. These moments were rare. They were never enough to stop the killing or end the war. But they remind us that even in the darkest of times, the light of human compassion is never entirely extinguished. Victor died in 1987, 2 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall that might have allowed him to search for answers about what happened to the Germans he met that night. He was buried in the village cemetery where generations of his ancestors lay, a simple grave marked by a simple stone. Few who attended his funeral knew about his wartime experiences. Fewer still knew about the night in the frozen bunker. But the story survived, passed down through whispered conversations and fragmentary written accounts until it reached us today. It is a small story in the vast tapestry of the Second World War, barely a footnote in the larger narrative of armies and battles and strategic decisions. But it is an important story nonetheless, because it reminds us of something we too often forget. The soldiers who fight our wars are not abstractions. They are human beings with families and dreams and fears. And even in the worst of circumstances, they are capable of extraordinary acts of compassion. Thank you for staying through this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. If this story has moved you, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with others who appreciate the human side of war. The history of the Eastern Front is filled with untold stories like this one, stories that challenge our assumptions and deepen our understanding of what human beings are capable of in both the worst and the best of times. The frozen bunker has long since crumbled back into the earth from which it was built. The snow that covered it in the winter of 1943 has melted and fallen again countless times. The men who shared that night, Soviet and German alike, are all gone now, carried away by time like everything else. But the memory of what happened there, the fragile connection that formed between enemies in the darkness, endures. It reminds us that even in the coldest of winters, even in the depths of the bloodiest war humanity has ever known, the warmth of human compassion can survive.